Could you tell us just a little bit about your daily work, just a briefing? Kathleen.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I am the preservation chief for Miami-Dade County, so I oversee all historic preservation in the unincorporated parts of the county, but also for the 24 municipalities in our county that don't have their own preservation board. The Miami-Dade County has 34 municipalities in it. 10 of them have their own historic preservation board, and the other 24 are under us. A lot of what I do every day is putting out fires, but we currently are managing several major historic preservation projects around the county. We also are actively pursuing historic designations of individual buildings and one district right now. We try to regularly do outreach and education to the community. So actually next week I'm giving another presentation to a large group of people about what we're doing at the county, historic preservation wise. And I think the education and outreach is super important. Something about Miami that just really aggravates me is that a lot of people there say, well, we don't have any history here. What is it you're preserving? And yes, it's true, South Florida is not as aged, seasoned yet as New England or Europe or other places like that. But what I reply to them is that you need to learn about the historic places we do have, and then you will know the breadth of historic resources our county does have. And if we don't save them now, we will never have things 100 years from now that are worth looking at and to talk about what the history of that community was. So, in a nutshell, I do a lot of different things on a daily basis.
Thank you. Ray.
Well, I think I was just thinking about in my job description. I have two jobs that I do for free. I'm the past president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. I just finished a 2-year term, and I was the vice president before that. A lot of travel around the state, dealing with a lot of issues like Kathleen at the state level. And I'm still the vice chairman of the Florida Historical Commission, which is the government branch of the advocacy side, which the Florida Trust is the advocacy side. So those are my pro bono jobs. And then I'm an architect by daytime. We have an office of 16 architects in our office, and we have worked in over 12 historic districts around the state, from St. Augustine down to Delray Beach, down to the Keys too, and a little bit on the west coast of Florida, but home base in Palm Beach County. And I just started a 4th new job. This summer we were visiting Christine, the Florida Trust for our board meeting, and we found out that the city of Boynton Beach, the commissioners and the mayor, wanted to demolish the old high school in Boynton Beach. After many years of trying to salvage, I think I've done like 8 studies for different uses on that property over 12 years. The first one was the week right after 9/11 years ago. So I mean, it's an amazing building. And so I said, we're missing one thing in preservation. We talk about preservation, we complain about preservation, we post about preservation, but we're not doing anything to save preservation. So I restarted a development company that had been dormant during the recession, and with some partners we're trying now to salvage this old school and put it into an adaptive reuse, similar to what some other folks are trying to do around the state, which is finding the economics, to make sure that preservation is here, that buildings are reused and they're not demolished on a daily basis, because the mayor thinks he needs a parking lot where a beautiful old building might be located.
Thank you. Kristen.
Sitting Sanford Historic Preservation. What I do there is I do a lot of education and outreach with property owners. I provide a lot of technical assistance. We have over 500 properties in our historic districts. That means that property owners get approval in advance via a form called a Certificate of Appropriateness for work on their properties. And we provide a lot of technical assistance in that regard because initially we get a lot of pushback from property owners when they don't understand the process. A lot of times when they realize that someone who's knowledgeable in preservation, helping them actually saves them time and saves them money, we have a lot more buy-in. So a lot of the work that I do is very much education and outreach. I work a lot with our building department to ensure that historic properties are recounted according to historic standards, whether or not they're in or outside of the historic district. So, for example, if we have a landmark building or something that's outside of district boundaries and doesn't have to get approvals, they will still send the building drawings to me to make sure that no historic fabric is being damaged unnecessarily. So we kind of do a proactive type of review. There's a lot of different things. I'm also the city's community planner, so I work with the communities to improve quality of life. I work with one community in particular, which is the Georgetown neighborhood. It was settled as an African-American neighborhood on the east side of our city's downtown. And we just recently completed a $2.5 million project in that neighborhood to do a streetscape. So a lot of livability, quality of life, things on a day-to-day basis. And just like with Kathleen, on a daily basis, putting out a lot of fires, a lot of emergencies.
Well, I'll tell you briefly about something that's actually fairly current in Miami-Dade County. One of the municipalities that is under our jurisdiction is on a little island in Biscayne Bay. That means it's waterfront property. Okay. It also happens to have the largest concentration of mid-century architecture, I think possibly anywhere in the nation, for sure in Florida. And for those of you who may not be very familiar with that, mid-century architecture down in South Florida has been coined, we use the term MIMO, it's short for Miami Modern, but it's mid-century architecture. And this is the next wave, the next era that preservationists are now preserving. Art Deco was like the last big thing we preserved, right? In the 80s, we were preserving the Art Deco from the 20s and 30s. So now we have moved on to the mid-century architecture of the 50s and early 60s. So the problem with having 2- and 3-story garden-style apartment buildings, little condominium structures that exhibited the mid-century style just can't keep up with the value of the land underneath it. People are able to build 7 to 8, I think they're capped at 75 feet, so they can go 7 floors. Because the county currently does not have a lot of economic incentives available for people to keep their historic buildings, the incentives just aren't there. And so in the last year alone, we had 32 demolitions on one island of what we would have considered a contributing structure, a structure that contributed to that field. And this, I'm sorry that we don't have slideshows prepared for you, because I really would like to show you the visuals, and if you are interested, I can always send it to you. But going onto this island, you really felt like you were going back into 1950s Florida. It was incredible. And the rapid rate of destruction that's happening right now is really, really wearing away at the integrity of the character of that community. Now, there's a big part of the island, the people that actually live there are incensed over this. They are actually, that's not what they moved. They moved to that little island because it had that character. And so the people that are coming in and developing the properties and tearing down the older structures are not people that live there. They're overseas investors for the most part. They're there to make money. They're not staying on the island. They're there to sell the units and get out. The other really interesting and sad, but interesting thing we're seeing coming out of that is that people can no longer afford to live there. The units are going from a 2-bedroom, 2-bath that may have cost $300,000. Now the same unit on the same spot of land, the units are going for $1.5 million. Okay? So if you have done this all over the island, you are literally turning the island into a place that is basically empty condos, and it's really, really sad. So that's something we're grappling with right now.
Miami Herald was one in Miami, which we had a great fight that we were not able to save. A building that was, met all the categories of preservation, and it was demolished to become an empty piece of land for a developer from Indonesia, so that was just sitting vacant. But probably the one that probably hurts the most is a case that we were working on for the last 2 years with the SHPO, with Rob Bendis and myself, the Bellevue Biltmore Hotel in Bel Air, which is a little town next to Clearwater, which has a wonderful ordinance, historic preservation ordinance, and a comprehensive plan that was violated and ignored by the mayor, by the commissioners, by the city manager, by a well-to-do developer from St. Pete with a very well-connected zoning lawyer. And frankly, what they want to do, what they've done against there are 2 lawsuits, by the way. The Florida Trust has sued them, and the National Trust has sued them. And even though the lawsuits are going through, they continue with the demolition. Like the Miami Herald, these very large buildings, the Miami Herald was 750,000 square feet. And it took them over a year and a half to demolish it because it was built like a tank, you know, to bring in newspaper barges and to be hurricane-proof in the 1950s. This was 100 years older, so it was built with what I call Dade County pine, which is, you know, the strongest kind of wood that you can find. 500,000 square feet. It was one of the most wonderful Queen Anne hotels, the only one in Florida. Plant did it, you know, for Florida. Similar to the Coronado in California, the Washington, and I think there's like 3 or 4 left in the nation. This is the last one. And basically, it's the story of Florida. I'm going to demolish it because it's too big, it's in the way. There's a golf course over here, and we're better off with a blank piece of paper, right? Because God forbid, and the SHPO and I actually went, spent our own time, we drove to St. Pete, he drove from Tallahassee, I drove from West Palm Beach, we met with the developer for about an hour and a half, 2 years ago. We actually came back and drew sketches for free to show him many things he could do with the building. You know, one wing could have been a high-end ACLF, another wing could have been a hotel, a third wing could have been high-end condominiums with concierge services. I mean, no-brainers for everybody in this room, but the one problem that we saw, and I think it's a very big problem in Florida, is that although he's a very successful developer, and God bless him, he's done a lot of great things in St. Pete, he's never done historic projects. So I think because he didn't have the historic bug, he never did a historic building, couldn't comprehend or the will or the desire to actually try to pursue the study of the building. And because we were coming out of the recession, you know, there was an urge of, you know, the building's empty, it's been rotting, which it wasn't, let's knock it down. And so they haven't finished knocking it down. The courts haven't made a decision, so it would be very interesting to see if the courts, if we would prevail and force them to reconstruct. I doubt that's going to happen. But one of the things that's going to happen, and I just spoke to the SHPO yesterday on my way up here, you know, talking about this subject.
Tell them what SHPO is.
Oh, I'm sorry. The SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Officer. So he's the one that oversees all of the preservation work here in the state of Florida on the government side. So one of the things that we are doing is that they are going to get decertified as a CLG, which I know we're going to talk about that later. And that has never happened in the history of the National Park Service. No city has been decertified. They're the first one, and I think that's going to send out quite a message to the others in the state, you know, that, you know, Florida, yes, it's changing, Florida's growing, and preservationists need to understand that we are here to manage that growth, to direct that growth, not to stop the growth. We cannot stop the growth. What we can stop and change is how that growth occurs in our cities and our places, you know, so we're going to lose our Florida historical places if we don't put on that hat and start thinking about ways to counter the effect of developers and others that are just coming in, and government, mayors that are just, they want to see the cash base, knock it down, because my God, he's going to build 6 cookie-cutter condominium buildings, 20 townhouses. What else are we doing? I mean, something else just totally crazy. So that was really painful. You know, that's really, I think, it's a major one, but there'll be some good, because there's karma in the world, you know, like the CLG and the SHPO is very involved now. There are other towns that are also going to be put on notice that are not doing a good job with their preservation ordinances. And I think it's been a wake-up call for the state.
Unfortunately, the Bellevue Bullhorn, as the one that Rick was talking about, it really reminds me of New York's Penn Station. I don't know if you all have ever heard about that preservation disaster, but everyone thought there was no way that Penn Station could ever get torn down because it was such a magnificent building. And it did get torn down, but what that resulted in was creation of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. So even though we lost that building, it did spur something big, and I think that that's what's going to happen with Bullhorn, because if you pull up photos of that building, you would just be shocked. It's really a tragedy. But in our neck of the woods, I think probably our saddest thing is the city had a real push in the 70s and 60s of demoing historic structures, because if you have a vacant lot, all this development is going to come. So what happened was that really disconnected our downtown from the lakefront. So we have people come to Sanford for the first time, and they come to our Riverwalk, and wow, they love our Riverwalk, it's wonderful, and they have no clue that 2 blocks over is a historic downtown. They just have no clue. And then conversely, people will visit our historic downtown and absolutely have no clue that there is a beautiful lakefront right there. And so disconnecting that fabric of the community is probably one of the worst things that's happened, in my opinion, in San Francisco history, because it wasn't just historic preservation, and it disconnected the actual fabric of our downtown. We're actively actually reconstructing that right now. The city has assembled 3 city blocks, and we've put an RFQ out for developers, and in that RFQ, we're making sure that whatever developer we get in is preservation friendly, because that's another misconception, is that a lot of people think that preservationists are anti-development. I am one of the most pro-development people you'll ever meet. I love development. I love good development. I love ecologically sensitive development, and I love development that is in harmony with historic preservation. So not all development is bad, and preservationists, I would say all 3 of us here probably. But on a smaller scale, another one, because I think this was just such an unnecessary loss, is we had a building downtown that wasn't being maintained, and for some reason, and I would say it's probably for political reasons, because the building owner has political connections, they weren't having to deal with code violations because they weren't getting in trouble for the lack of maintenance on the building. And what happened was, over time, the roof gutters filled with debris, the water was not shedding from the roof. The roof just filled with water. It was a parapet roof, so it just filled like a swimming pool, and eventually it took the entire block down because the roof collapsed, and when the roof collapsed and caved in, it took all the walls down with it. So, and that was right up downtown. So to me, that was another big tragedy, because even though it was just a kind of average commercial building, because of where it was located, it really did have a big impact in our downtown.
And was that recent, Christine?
No, that was about 11 years
That
ago.
was okay. So,
We do not have a provision in our ordinance that even requires us to get owner consent to do either individual designations or districts. However, because you are dealing with a lot of different people and personalities and people's property rights, our ordinance strongly encourages that we get the approval of people to do so. But it's not mandated at all.
and is that ever used?
Yes,
Okay.
it is used. We try not to do historic designations, either individually or by districts, when there's just overwhelming opposition.
And the
But-
designation is important because that would mean that there would be restrictions on demolition or other restrictions.
Correct. If your house is designated, or there's so many facets to this, because there's a lot of misconceptions that swirl around the whole notion of historic designation, whether individual or in a district. And so we always try, again, previous to doing so, we try to do a workshop for that neighborhood, or for that block of people, or for whoever, so that these misconceptions can be addressed and hopefully the myths dispelled. But we try not to do it when there's so many people against it. However, our ordinance also provides a checks and balance system. So if something gets designated, if you don't like the Historic Preservation Board's decision, you can appeal that decision to our county commission. Recently, 2 of our Historic Preservation Board designations did get appeals to the county commission, and the county commission did overturn it. So the county commission undid the designation recently for 2 buildings that the Historic Preservation Board just did. Now, whatever their reasons are, you know, the Preservation Board uses its criteria to determine whether a building or a district is worth protecting. That may not be the same reason why a commission or city council overturns that. But every person within that's being affected by a Historic Preservation Board decision, at least in our county, and I'm sure it's in everybody's ordinance. Usually there is an appeals process, but every person has the right to, appeal that.
In terms of the historic districts, you know, they vary across the street for the state. For example, West Palm Beach, about 20 to 25% of the city has a total of about 12 districts, so that's rather unusually large. Most of the cities I've encountered are like Winter Park. 5% of the homes are considered historic. The paper we got, right, 500 homes out of 8,700 homes are of historic quality. That's 5%. So one of the arguments that I've been trying to make around the state in these lectures and other conversations at the Florida Trust is that that's only 5%. So if you want to go build a McMansion, go pick on the other 95%. Right? I mean, go find a spot not in that historic district. I mean, come on, 95% of the city is available for you, right? So that's one of the issues. The other issue that I've been dealing with a lot is the private property rights, right? The untouchable private property rights. We were talking about that on the conference call yesterday, right? Well, each one of these private property rights is on a public right of way, right? Unless they're behind a gated community, right? If they're behind a gated community in a golf course, go for it. Go demolish it, go do whatever you want. That's a private community with private roads, private water, and private sewer. But if they're in a public right of way, and by the way, a right of way is not just a road, it's a street, a boulevard, it's also an alley, it's also lakefront, it's also waterfront, riverfront, oceanfront, right? That's all in the state of Florida. That is a public area. So because of that public participation, there is a limit to this private rights. This is a big tragedy right now in Miami Beach where we're losing so many of these homes, you know? And that's one side of the equation. And then the horrible part is what's being replaced. I'm not sure if this is happening here in Winter Park, but in Miami Beach, you're losing a 3,000 nice historic home and you're getting a 9,000, you know, on steroids, modern thing that, you know, the spaceships have landed. The Martians are taking over Miami Beach. So the public right of way, you know, I mean, the private property rights and the districts, you know, is something that we need to start fighting for, you know, because we're a very limited area, very special. And that's a standard, by the way. You know, 5% of the community is a special Florida historical place, right? That's a very unique thing. Why is historic preservation important? Because it creates the identity and the sense of your town and of your place. Winter Park is different from St. Augustine, different from Key West, different from Palm Beach, different from other many places, historic places in Florida. So we really need to use these standards more effectively and educate our leaders and educate the developers and the architects, my profession. You know, there's a lot of people doing very bad things right now, you know, so, and you know, and I'm hopefully not one of them, you know, so I mean, there's a lot of conversation that we have to do, and I'm really pleased that Winter Park has invited the 3 of us here tonight to talk about this, because we need to have more of these community talks around the state.
We have people looking at properties in Sanford right now, and realtors call me all the time. When are you all expanding historic districts? I get this call all the time. And the reason why the question is being asked is because realtors taking people around town, and if the house is a block or 2 outside of the historic district, these want to be in the historic district. Find us a house in the historic district. And I'm not kidding, this is constant. I have so many realtors calling me, well, can't the city just like pull the boundary out over here? And it's just really, especially since the economy has picked up and we have more activity in the housing market, it's really just a constant thing when it happens. So we've had actually a lot of requests of what's the city's plan? You have all these historic areas that are not designated. What's the city doing? And we are actually working on a citywide historic preservation plan right now, so we can get funding to do survey and inventory for additional historic districts. But I thought that was funny because people always say, you know, historic districts, it's not attractive, it decreases land value, but that is not at all what we're seeing in our town. That's where people want to be.
It's become like a psychological thing too. You know, you see a lot of TV shows now about fixing houses and flipping property, and they talk about, well, some properties, you know, psychologically they're just wrong. There's something wrong with them. So now, I think what we're seeing a lot more now is the opposite of that. People are saying psychologically, oh, I have to be in a district, you know, because Northwood Hills is really special, you know. But I'm on 45th Street and the district ends on 38th Street, so I'm not in Northwood Hills. Oh God, I'm by the railroad tracks or something like that. So it's, you know, like the good housekeeping brand, right? I mean, everybody wanted that in the 50s and 60s. So preservation neighborhood could be the good housekeeping brand of this century.
And Kathleen, did you wish I had
Oh, of course. This is so exciting. We could be here all night. Like, City of Coral Gables has 23 historic districts. City of Miami has 9 historic districts. So we have so many historic districts throughout the municipalities in the county. Miami Beach has a ton of historic districts. And there's no documented case anywhere that we've been able to find where being within the historic district lowers the property value. It's the opposite. It's absolutely the opposite. Why is that? Well, you know, if you can buy into a neighborhood where you know that your own investment can be fairly protected because the guy next to you is not going to be able to build some outrageous thing, that makes you more comfortable investing in that neighborhood. The historic districts in our community usually get better public works projects out of the cities. They usually have better crime statistics. They usually have some kind of historic neighborhood or homeowners association. And so those people are able to make more noise at the city hall level, and they get more attention than the neighborhood right across the street from it. We have historic districts that have better street furniture, better street signs than the neighborhood right across from it. They have better tree planting programs. They have better, I mean, and the list goes on. Not only that, the city and county historic preservation grants or other home improvement funds are usually only available to those in the historic districts. And just to quickly end, because I know you want to move on, but in the city of Miami, the last 2 historic districts that were designated, and that's the Limo Biscayne Historic District and the Buena Vista East Historic District. The Buena Vista East Historic District is the largest residential district in the city of Miami. It's almost 800 buildings, and both those districts, they wanted it. They wanted it. They came to City Hall. Of course, there were always some people that opposed it, but the majority of the people in these neighborhoods wanted it. The neighborhood, the residential neighborhood that was right behind Biscayne Boulevard, saw the new development that was starting to encroach from Biscayne Boulevard, for those of you that don't know, is actually a state highway, and it's a very large arterial road that runs through the east part of Miami-Dade County. The residential neighborhood behind it was starting to see encroachment of new and out of character development coming into the residential neighborhood, and they wanted to not have that. So they wanted the historic districts. We do workshops for realtors all the time. all the time, because, and for the most part, I mean, all of them will tell you, no, our clients want buildings in historic districts.
How does that?
It's a really good question, because that's part of the large misconceptions, that you can't do anything to a historic building. You can, and we don't regulate the interiors at all. So what you want to do inside, great. You want to build an addition on the side or the back, great. You want to do another 3-story addition, but it's set far enough back and it's compatible with your 2-story house, great. There are things you can do with a historic building. All the historic preservation staff, all we're doing, yes, it's one added layer of protection, I call it. You would call it regulation, I call it protection. Furthering, we are helping you retain your property values, people. But all we're looking at really within that one added layer is that you're not pulling out casement windows to put in sliders. That kind of change of a major architectural feature to a building changes the historic integrity. We're just looking to make sure you're not taking off a barrel tile roof and putting on a flat asphalt shingle. That changes the character. And I think, you wanted to say something? You look ready to jump in. Go ahead.
What I was going to say, and I would be interested to hear the numbers from Kathleen, but our certificate of appropriateness, which is what the city will issue, that gives the property owner the green light to go ahead with work on their property. In our community, probably about 90% of those are what we call minor review. That means you bring the paperwork to staff, we take a look at it, and we say yay or nay. It's really only about 10% that goes through our historic preservation board. That's the middle of the C of A, as we call it. It's an opportunity for us to engage with the property owner and discuss their proposed project. What I see more often than not is a contractor trying to make a lot of money on a property owner and advising a property owner of something that they must have done and that it's going to be cheaper for the property owner to go this route. And when in reality, the only one that's really helping is that contractor. And the contractors also oftentimes give this information to the property owners, where they'll say things like, oh no, the city won't let you fix your original wood windows. Original wood windows are not legal anymore. You have to rip them out and do X, Y, Z. So 90% of that approval process is finding out what is your scope of work, what do you want to do, why do you want to do that. A lot of times property owners are concerned with energy efficiency or saving money on their rehab project. And when you could guide them in different ways where they realize it really isn't going to cost them more money, or if it is going to cost them money, there's a value to be had in that. And it just, so I'm not sure, what would you say about the number of CVAs and that also?
Well, we agree. The majority of work that we help homeowners with, we've actually saved them a ton of money. And I think Christine said something earlier that was really on target, is that you know how difficult it is to work with the building department, right? Right? It's not easy getting building permits and things like that. We become the go-between between the applicant and the building department, and so often we are able to help facilitate a much quicker processing of people's plans, because we want the right thing done for that house. So we're pushing the plans from the inside.
And just like we talked about the 5%, the communities, then hire the 5% of the professionals that get it right. The good realtors, the good architects, the good builders, the people that know what they're doing. I mean, we do a lot of residential work in historic districts. It's not rocket science. We were just talking earlier, right, about the architecture's there. You don't need to put your ugly big thumbs on the front of that house. You got a lot of room in the back if you want to really butcher it. Right on the side, you're allowed to build on the side. You're allowed to build on the back side. If it's a 1-story, don't put a 2-story addition. I mean, some of it is really, really logical. So I don't think it's going to be a matter of getting people to say you can't do this. Or the argument on the phone yesterday, okay, what about the mid-century houses or the ranch houses, I want to share a really quick side story with you. Our CFO, Jeff Atwater, bought a mid-century ranch house, 1950s in North Palm Beach. We just finished a big renovation for him. He kept the house, we gave it a front porch, it was missing a front porch, family room addition, redid the kitchens, back porch. He hugged me 4 times the day he moved into the house. He was like, you know, here's a politician, like one of the top politicians who's getting an appreciation for preservation. Instead of doing what everybody in North Palm Beach is doing right now, which is just tearing down the house, right, and building something big, you know, so he has more value. His neighbors are telling him he has more value, right? Sits on the front porch, people walk by, you know, so it's more sense of community, and that big modern box that you might see in Miami Beach or in other places, you know, so really working with the regulators, like they said, or the protectionists, you know, there's ways to do that. We have about 60 of them, and it's a really good program. It's a way to get additional funding, additional grants from from the federal government. You know, it helps with the state government too. As long as you have a good ordinance, you know, and you're implementing and doing it, you're fine. There's no additional review.
What the CLG designation is, that is awarded by the state to communities who have approved historic preservation programs and historic preservation ordinances. So if you have a historic preservation program and ordinance that's been approved by the state and that's been adopted by your community, then you can become a CLG. The CLG is a benefit program to communities that filters federal money down to the local level, and that is all a CLG is. A CLG will never come in, you know, the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, will never come in and say, you're a CLG, so now you additionally have to do X, Y, Z. The only time a heightened standard would be applied is in a grant project. And that's valid, because if the state is giving you money for this project, you need to comply with their standards.
I think one of the areas where it doesn't go too far is on the type of people that need to be on the board. You need to have not only a registered architect, but move those 2 words and put historic preservation registered architect in the middle. So someone that has architectural experience, because otherwise, and that's really doing preservation work, not doing demolition work, calling themselves preservation. So I think that's very important to have that. I think you can't let it get politicized. That's the biggest problem we have in the state of Florida right now. It's not just here, folks. It's everywhere in the state of Florida. It's my buddy getting on the board, taking over the board, bringing in his buddies and so forth, and all of a sudden you have a historic preservation board that's not doing its job, you know? Right? So that, you know, stopping that, and the only way to stop that is by, and I hate to say this, by electing mayors and commissioners that get.
I think you have in your proposed ordinance change something about reducing the threshold for historic district designation. I think that would really benefit this community. Like I said, some counties don't even require a threshold, okay? We don't require any percentage threshold, but if a community wants to do that, 50% plus 1 is certainly a majority. So I would really support you doing that, because at the end of the day, it's not about, it's not, none of us are out to like irritate people or take away anyone's property rights or anything like that. It's just about preserving what you like about your community. It's about, why do you live here? What neighborhoods do you like to drive through? Why do you stay here? And more often than not, if you really ask yourself that question, it's going to be, oh, we have this awesome historic little downtown, and we have this awesome little place to go shopping, and we have these great neighborhoods that contribute to the character of our neighborhood. So I really think you should support some of those changes, really.
Rick wants me to talk about demolition. One thing that I did want to say is that people think that when you create a historic preservation ordinance, that's the ordinance that's it forever. That's not the case. If your ordinance is working, you have to go through the very process that Winter Park is doing right now. You have to periodically reevaluate your ordinance in the context of what is happening development-wise, and there are other factors, and really change your ordinance to kind of make sure that it's being effective. So changing an ordinance is not bad. Some people think, well, if it was okay, we wouldn't need to make changes to it. That's just not the way the ordinances are. The second comment that I want to make is the demolition delay. I think that having a demolition delay is completely valid. This argument that it's going to be this big adverse impact doesn't really hold water with me. If you know anything about permitting and drawing up plans and all of that, and the time it takes to go through that whole process and get all those approvals issued, that's going to be the time you're waiting out your demolition delay. So I think that that part in the ordinance it's completely fair. And I think that all the changes that have been proposed are fair, because when the group started, they started here and they met halfway. So I think a real effort has been made.
Different communities around the state do different things with the whole demolition thing. And I'll just give you an example of what one community in our county does. The city of Coral Gables has a very strong historic preservation program, and they heavily benefit off of that economically, livability of the community. But even if you, so what they have, even if the building is not designated, if a demolition permit comes in for that building and it's previous to a certain year, that demolition permit has to be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Department. And the Historic Preservation Department can actually flag the building as potentially designation worthy. Now, that is a community that has a very strong preservation ethic. That might be too much for this community, okay? But giving an extra 30, 60 days to try to find a solution is really nothing. This community just astounded me when you all saved the Capen House. And I remember all that effort. It was really a grassroots effort. So give yourself the time to be able to save some of these amazing, amazing places. We're actually, the county we are doing an ordinance revision ourselves right now, because ordinances are pieces of legislation. And pieces of legislation, you have to regularly look at it and update it. And one of the things we're looking at is additional economic incentives. We already have in our ordinance an incentive, a tax exemption incentive that gives you an exemption for a period of 10 years. Yes, but that's only available if you're actually doing work to the building. If you're making an improvement, to your building that is designated, and that improvement causes your taxable value to go up, then you can be exempt from any additional tax increase. And so basically, essentially, it freezes your current tax structure for a period of 10 years. We already have that, but that doesn't really help people that either don't have the money to put into a historic building, or they're being offered developer money. They're just being thrown at some of these people. So what we're looking into is finding out a way, how can we give people who own historic properties and who live under our one additional layer of value protection, our one additional layer, how can we give those people some kind of tax benefit just for living in a historic house or district? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is yet, because to actually give another kind of tax exemption takes a state charter amendment, and it gets wonky. We're also trying to look at utilizing an existing state tax law that counties and cities can right now adopt if you want to, whereby if you have a commercial property or an income-producing property, or you're a nonprofit with a historic building, you can be assessed, your property can be assessed at the actual use, instead of being assessed for the land value, because everything around you might be going up, 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 up. But because you are a designated structure, you're kind of limited with what you can do, right? So you can go to the tax appraiser and utilize that one. We want to find another really useful program. If it's structured right, And if it's only available to historic buildings, and this would have helped in my situation where all the mid-century buildings were being demolished. A transfer of development rights program. Okay? Basically, if you have a building that can go up this high, but the zoning says you can build this high, you could, and this is a historic building, if you designate this, then you can sell these air rights, okay, to another property. That becomes a very good incentive for people to keep their historic buildings, all right? Because you're able, okay, fine, you're not gonna let me demolish it and build my 7 stories, but I can sell chunks of my air rights off to other people in different parts. Now, your town, your city has to properly identify, right? Donor and receiver sites. You can't just go around and start throwing up additional height anywhere you want. That has to be done at logical receiver sites. But this is a huge, in City of Miami they do it, in City of Coral Gables they do it, and this is a huge benefit to developers who want to maybe build an additional floor on a property, and if they can buy the rights off of a historic building, the historic building makes money, the owner of the historic building makes money, and the developer is able to build one more story.
And I want to give you a quick specific example. In West Palm Beach, we took a historic district for St. Anne's Catholic School, parish, downtown West Palm Beach. We sold 2 3-story buildings, they developed to 6. We sold the development rights to the PDRs for $2 million to a condo developer in the big section of town where all the high-rises were, so you could go from 15 to 20. With that money, we restored the campus, we created a program for scholarships for minority students, and we helped fund a gymatorium, a new building, a new small building across the street. So it was a win-win. It's a national trust case study, and it's the kind of idea that Kathleen is talking. Another idea in the marketplace right now, too, is the idea of, we know federal tax credits. When you do a hotel or a big historic building, you can get a one-time 20%, if you follow the standards, 20% deduct. That's a very good number. I'm doing a $6 million project right now in West Palm Beach, and they're going to get $1 million back if they do it the right way. There is a group of people that have been very successful getting a state historic tax credit approved in states that do not have income tax, like Florida. So Louisiana is doing it, Texas is doing it. The Florida Trust was going to try to start that to happen here in Florida, but our session this year was a little bit crazy, so it's been postponed, tabled for a while. You know, and the idea is to try to push that so that even the larger buildings, or even historic buildings, can take advantage of that, you know, in construction. And then very quickly on the historic architect, you know, it's very interesting. The Boynton Beach High School that we're trying to restore, this historic architect had come in before and had promised the stars and the moons to the city of Boynton Beach, and he was proposing these glass structures in front of the building because, you know, he had to put his thumbs on the building. I Googled him. I went home and I was so upset. I said, let me Google this guy, see if he's real. You know, he said he had friends in Sarasota that knew him from historic properties. I called friends in Sarasota, and no one had ever heard from this guy. On his website, there was nothing historic, you know, so you Google somebody, you know. And the other thing the Florida Trust is trying to do with in advocacy, and like other groups, like the New Urbanist, for example. If you're a New Urbanist right now, you can get certified to become a New Urbanist, right? So we're trying to create a seal of certification so that the realtors, architects, SHPOs, you know, HPOs, everybody that's in preservation can hopefully, you know, get a certification that says that you legitimately do this kind of work. But in the meantime, just Google them.
Yeah.
If there's any projects in our historic districts, go to our historic preservation board first. Because before they get too far down the road of development, we need to make sure that that building, or whatever the development is going to be in character with the historic district. So rather than it work in reverse, where now the historic preservation board is having to look at something that may not necessarily fit, we always send things to our HPD first. Then as far as working together in a spirit of partnership, right now what our historic preservation board does is, I'm very proud of our board. We have a very active board. They don't just review their applications and go home. Our board for years now has met for about an hour and a half before the board meeting to either have trainings where Sometimes I'll train them on certain architectural styles or tax credit programs or things like that. And now for the past little over a year, our board has met to talk about developing a citywide historic preservation plan. And that preservation plan would be absolutely no regulations involved in that plan whatsoever. It's just a framework for looking at historic resources citywide, because we have many more historic resources outside of our district, and planning for the future of those resources. So one of the things that Sanford is really doing is looking at heritage tourism. So how can we kind of develop our community to have an economy that is on par with St. Augustine or Savannah and places like that, because we have all the elements there. And so I would say, the board taking on a project and committing to a project, like a preservation plan, that then gets approved by your city council or city commission. That's because once you have a plan that's been adopted, then you kind of get more buy-in from the boards too. With our citywide historic preservation plan, we're going to take it to a certain point, and we are going to have a joint planning session with our planning and zoning commission. After our joint planning session with the PMZ, we will make more changes to that plan, and then we'll take it to our city commission.
Okay, so I like to piggyback on that. So see, Sanford uses planning to think big, right? They want to be the next Savannah. That's a pretty great idea, right? Why not? They have the parks, the neighborhoods. That's what planning is for. Do not let your historic preservation board fold into a planning board. That would be the biggest mistake that you could do in this town. The best is the opposite. We helped the city of Lake Worth create a historic preservation board so that they now have, it's a small town, it's becoming very popular again. They now have a historic preservation board with the right experts and volunteers, people like you that are involved. And if you're on the planning and zoning board, your experience is different. There are very few architects that spend time on historic boards that know, what's happening there. So, keep it separate. Another thing you can do, and again, Palm Beach is the extreme. They have 3 boards. They have a landmarks commission, which deals with every historic building. They have an ARCOM, Architectural Review Commission, which reviews all the new stuff, right? So you have the historic, the new stuff, and then they have a planning and zoning board that works with the board. So it's a triangular relationship. It's a really strong method of preserving and protecting with the new construction, and then thinking big, like Sanford, in terms of the planning issues that need to happen. But don't let your historic board merge with the city planning and zoning.
None of the communities in Miami-Dade County that have their own historic preservation boards do so in conjunction with planning and zoning board. They need to stay separate. First of all, each of the boards, respective boards, have way too much on their plate as it is. Those meetings would never end. I mean, the planning and zoning has enough to deal with, and the historic preservation boards have enough to deal with. There are some communities that have a little bit of crossover in that, not between boards, but because, like the city of Miami, they have given their historic preservation board the authority to do some zoning variations, per se, for historic properties, like setbacks or the number of parking requirements or landscape requirements. The city of Miami has given some of the zoning powers to the Historic Preservation Board for the purposes of protecting a historic building. Yeah, because you don't want to ruin a historic building just because you're required to put in an extra 4 parking spaces. It's ridiculous. But they are, in all the communities we work with, they are completely separate boards. Our preservation ordinance and the communities that have their own preservation ordinances, the requirements for board construction and who's on your board it's very heavily into the historic preservation side of it, and construction and real estate and that sort of thing, law. So.
Thank you. Yes,
Before I sat on the state board, I was on the board of architects and interior designers. They regulate architecture practice, interior design practice, life, safety, and welfare. That's it. They can't touch historic, they can't touch sustainability, they can't touch anything else. Same thing with the general contractors, and same thing with engineers and so forth. So the state can't do that on the state side of business because it would be completely different to the other states. What we can do is through the Florida Trust, which is a nonprofit do advocacy and do those kind of things that you're mentioning. In other words, you know, through the Florida Trust, for example, one of the things in our yearly retreats that we had in Stanford, you know, we created something that, in fact, where's Betsy? Betsy's back there. Betsy is the first one to take advantage of this program, a TPT, which stands for Tactical Preservation Team. You're seeing the first Tactical Preservation Team show up to an event, right? So Betsy and I spoke about this about 3 months ago, right, Betsy? And then I think that's how this germinated the idea about this thing. We have people doing that. We have a planner from St. Augustine who will be here for your city commission on November 9th to speak on behalf of the Florida Trust to support all the wonderful things that this board of broad-based citizens group, right? So that's very important wording, right? Worked on so hard to get done. And she's going to stand up and make a statement. Kathleen and I did the same thing in the city of Miami Beach when things were haywire about a year ago. So, you know, that's how we're going to try to do more and more of this around the state through the Florida Trust. You know, who you're going to call, right? You're going to call the Florida Trust, and then hopefully somebody from around the state. We have people everywhere from Pensacola down to the Keys, and come and help and share some of the experiences with the local community.
We also have an informal group of historic preservation planners, and Kathleen and I are part of that group. And all of us, criteria for being in the group is we all work for local government. So we're dealing with the same issues, and we get together every couple of months or so. One part of the group gets together on some level, and we just talk about issues in our communities. We don't just talk about the awful things that are happening. We talk about the great things. So the ideas and the things that have happened in other communities as a result of looking at what one community did has been amazing.
Variety of communities. And I would argue that Winter Park is one of the gold standards of historic places in Florida. Right, so first, if everybody in leadership, right, the commissioners, the mayor, and everybody else, accept that, like Coral Gables, like Palm Beach, like St. Augustine, you're top notch. So because of that, then you can do, and I'd like you to ask what Miami-Dade did, you know, or what Orlando did, you know, but start with that premise, you know, that this is a gold standard place. This is one of the best finest places in Florida, and therefore, you know, these historic districts need to happen. Otherwise, you're going to end up like Miami Beach, which did it in the 80s, and they did South Beach, and then they forgot about it. It took a 25-year-old man, Daniel Sherello, at a commission meeting who grew up in Miami Beach, who brought a map to the city commission and said, there's South Beach. What about all these other places that are not historically designated? All right, to change the conversation in Miami Beach to the point where Tuesday, there's an election between the current status quo developer mayor and the chairman of the Historic Preservation Board who's running for mayor. So that's what it's going to be. So we couldn't get the teeth of a historic district there, but we passed a conservation district, which means the size, the scale of the buildings that exist on our Main Street are important to us. If you want to redevelop a property, you just can't knock down that beautiful or simple little vernacular 2-story building and put a 7-story building. What you can do is you can keep the 2-story building, a good portion of it to the back, and then you can do an addition. So as you walk the street, you still have the same scale of the street that you've always had.
So was that a separate ordinance then?
Look at be part of the historic. This is a conservation amendment.